All right. So now I think it's time to turn in the interview, and this probably should be its own segment, to talk about neo-apologetics and what your critiques are, because we now have moved. Many of us would celebrate the fact that we moved away from Daniel Peterson, Lou Midgley, Bill Hamblin. They're pretty much irrelevant now. I mean, Daniel Peterson might publish a editorial in the Deseret News every once in a while, but nobody really listens to them anymore. And, part of that's just that they're old, but part of it is they've been deinstitutionalized. And I think all of us kind of celebrated when that happened. Not that we wish any personal ill on any of them. We don't. But in that sense, the way that apologetics has moved into this new neo-apologetic sphere, there's so much to celebrate about it. It's not mean-spirited. There's no ad hominem. It's less distasteful in the sense that it's not offering, bad, shoddy scientific arguments. It's not even playing in the realm of truth claims. And the people are just generally nicer, and there's much more empathy. So this pastoral idea of like, be empathetic to doubters, be empathetic to those who are struggling, be kind to them, show compassion, show empathy. We're getting that in spades now. So you would think that we should all just sort of be celebrating and just say, hooray, victory. We got rid of bad, evil, old style apologetics. And now we've got new apologetics that's kind and gentle and loving and good.
Yeah.
And maybe that's how most people feel. But I started this series because I think, number one, it's important for us to understand the change that has happened. And it's important to understand what is happening. And then it's also important to look at the effects of what these changes might have. And so we discussed before sort of any critiques you might have of neo-apologetics.
Yeah.
And you can complement it as well, but I'm just wondering if you want to share that now.
So my critiques of neo-apologetics come from two angles. One is about Mormonism, and the other is just about how universities work in general. And I have to be honest, like I've been on a leave of absence from my PhD. I started working in real estate. I don't really look at Mormon books or blogs hardly at all these days. And so the precision with which I could make these arguments 10 or 12 months ago has definitely blunted.
Thank you for the disclaimer.
Yeah. And so, but like you're asking me, what are my general critiques of neo-apologetics?
Why isn't it just something to be celebrated and even followed?
Okay. This is a little tricky to articulate, but like politically and religiously, I see myself as being like of the left, if you will. Like I'm not right wing. And so I'm not talking about personal relationships. I'm talking about the way institutions function and policies and the way money flows and laws are made and everything like that. I feel like the values and principles of right wing ideologies is like a pretty clear and present danger or enemy, if you will. The thing that's really awkward, and I'm only barely beginning to discern, is that whatever represents kind of like the establishment liberal contingency in the church or in our nation seems more preoccupied with quashing like left-wing activism against right-wing policies and institutions, because they are in a position of power. And so if you threaten the dominant power structure, it will impact them.
So give your general reasoning for being a left wing.
Right.
What is your general critique about power in institutions that then we can apply to Mormonism and neo-apologetics?
So, like I'm a medievalist, right? I specialize particularly in the late medieval England. Are we good?
Keep on.
Okay. And I think we're taught like in like middle school about the Magna Carta, which was basically saying the king. I mean, I haven't read the Magna Carta in full, just a little bit here, but what I was taught as a kid was the king can't just do whatever he wants. Like the king is subject to some kind of rules, right? Rather than everybody else being subject to the king. And so I I think they instituted habeas corpus then in English common law, but during the Bush administration, habeas corpus in the United States was actually repealed. And I don't know how aware people are of this. And also with something like the Patriot Act, the Fourth Amendment, which protects citizens from search and seizure, and the Snowden revelations, I mean, like, it doesn't exist in practical terms. It still has like a law, it's on the books, but, or when it comes to freedom of assembly and you look at the Occupy movement and they're literally just like hanging out in Zuccotti Park, but then cops show up. This is under the Obama administration, okay? Cops show up and break people's wrists. They grab women's breasts and bruise them. They throw them in jail. I mean, like, it's just like bad stuff is happening. And so I value these civil liberties, and I do not come at it from a position which I would consider right-wing, that whoever is in the institution of power, whether it's the presidency of the nation or the presidency of the church or the director of some institution, research or university, whatever, that what they say is just like right because they say it because of the position that they hold. Like, I don't value that. I know a lot of people who do.
Anymore.
What's that?
Anymore.
I guess
you did it one time with the church.
I must have. Yeah, I must. But I feel like.
Well, like the ERA, like the example with your wife.
That's right.
The ERA.
No, that's true.
It's exactly what you did.
I definitely had it in me, but I don't ever feel like I was dyed in the wool that way. Sure. I felt like it was more elements of me.
Yeah.
And so I felt like as I become more aware of that in different aspects of my life or opinions or values I might hold, I tend to try to root that out because I don't like it.
So you don't like absolute authority. You're suspicious of too much power. Concentrated.
That's right.
So that's a general critique or concern.
Right. Okay. And so now that's a right-wing perspective. The among the left wing, and I distinguish left-wing political and left-wing religious. So when I refer to liberal apologetics, I'm not assuming that they have left-wing politics.
Right. Okay.
Liberal in the United States or Democrat is kind of the mainstream form of what gets called left-wing. But if you compare it with left-wing politics or religion in the United States historically over the last 100 years, then it actually looks centrist, but even right-wing of center. Or if you compare the United States to other countries as well, in the West or even in places like Kurdistan, if you want to go there. And so the people who are, if we can call it establishment left-wing, whether they are the ministers in churches like liberal churches or they are the mainstream left-wing media, MSNBC, a lot of people. I mean, I think Alex Jones watchers consider Fox News left-wing, so it's kind of, there's a sliding scale here. But, or whether it's at universities, right? We're taught to understand these are the powers that are trying to put pressure on the right-wing tyrannies. And I think that that's partially true. But what I've come to see is that these left-wing institutions, by and large, depend on right-wing power for their very existence. In our country, they do. Because the U.S. empire allows, like, the CIA, like government grants or whatever. And so that's what traditionally has funded science.
And so, like, that's why Democrats might support war as much as Republicans.
That's right.
Why corporations might give to Democrats as much as they give to Republicans.
That's right.
And in some ways, the ideological differences are just cosmetic to...
Right, yeah.
They're both being controlled by power. Is that...
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And how I see it is that we do have a political structure, but there's research like out of Princeton I saw, if you look at the last 30, 40 years and you look at policies that were popular, meaning they had, 60, 70% of popular support, but they went against corporate interest, every single time corporate interest is what became policy. Right. So I see power being in corporations primarily, and then politicians are largely like brands or things that people feel loyalty
and
to.
Democracy can become a myth where we really are.
Yeah.
It's really not the people that are in charge.
Yeah.
It's the power. It's the,
Right. Yeah.
So tie this to the church.
Okay. So the way that I tie this to the church is that if you're economically useless, I'm not saying you're useless as a person, but you don't produce something that increases the economic wealth of a space or whatever, then you depend on producers for your well-being. And the fact is, historians are not economic producers. They're useless from an economic perspective. Now, they can play a useful role. And there are historians that are, so I don't have a general critique about history, but I'm just pointing out, like, there are historians that are good at telling about what happened in the past, and then there are historians that are good about keeping their jobs, and sometimes they're the same person, sometimes they're not. And so this is how it works in churches with paid clergy, as far as that liberal institution goes, but as far as it works in universities, if it's very useful to hire people who, number one, are not willing to speak about certain things. Number two, are willing to speak about other things. And number three, because they're willing to speak about those other things, it looks like they are the force of transparency and they are the force of, like, unmasking power for what it really is. When ultimately they're using that as a shroud to cover all this other stuff that power is up to.
Intentionally or unknowingly?
I think oftentimes unknowingly, but it's kind of a thing where it's like, why would you look into the thing that could threaten your livelihood when you have a million other things to be doing ahead of that?
So we look at a Spencer Fluman, who obviously is employed by BYU in the church.
That's right, yeah.
But then we also have people like Patrick Mason or Philip Barlow, who are, yes, they're part of public institutions or private institutions that are independent from the church, but we know that the funding for their chairs, whether it's Patrick Mason's chair at Claremont or Phil Barlow's chair at Utah State, is funded by wealthy Mormon faithful donors.
That's right, yeah. Who are right-wing politically.
Yeah.
Almost always.
Right,
yeah.
But also, more importantly, have a very strong interest in the church's, all the stuff that shouldn't be talked about according to the church, that continues to be not talked about.
Yeah.
And then that the church is defended in whatever way it can be defended.
Well, and so this is actually a really key point, because at no point do I think there's a contract or a conversation where the donor says, now, just so let's be clear, these are the topics you're not supposed to talk about. I don't think that happens. It's like that story I told where it's
signaling. It's social signaling.
Right.
You learn over time. You see what happens to Michael Quinn. You see what happens to Greg Prince. You see what happens to John DeLynn. You see what people get in trouble for and what they don't. And through social codes and indirect anecdotes, you know what lines to cross and what lines not to cross.
Yeah, and some scholars are very conscious about this. Others are very intuitive about it. But, both of them depend on, this is what I mean. If Patrick Mason is, or Paul Reeve or whoever is invested in pushing progressive causes, they can only do it because they pull a paycheck from right-wing sources. Look, I think there are worse things that a person could do in their life. Okay, you could actually be the type of, like, openly racist, bigoted, sexist, like, patriot, whatever. Like I think, understandably, that's a problem.
And if we know Spencer or Patrick or Richard Bushman or Terrell Givens, because there's the official sort of people sitting in endowed chairs, and then there's the other neo-apologists like Bushman and Givens who are running around receiving money from very wealthy donors, being flown to cities and countries all over the world to do this neo-apologetics thing at these firesides, to publish these books sponsored by Deseret Book and others. Yeah. So there's those two classes of neo-apologists, right?
Yeah. And then there's also kind of like the up and comers, or the people who recognize there's money. They could make a career out of this. Now I just need to learn everything I need to do in order to like turn that tap on.
And who might
for
that
me.
be? That's Adam Miller.
Well, I mean, I couldn't say. Like, Adam doesn't seem to me terribly materialistic, or, you know, I think he's, I think that his investment is very genuine. Actually, probably all these people, it's very genuine.
No, they're
right?
they're not racist. They're not sexist. They're not homophobic. They want transparency. They want truth. They want openness. They care about people.
Yeah. But they want all that stuff up to a point.
Okay, so
right?
That's where we get to your critique.
Right, yeah. And
so we stipulate they're good-hearted people who want to be honest and truthful as much as they can. They want to see the church make positive changes. They want to see less LGBT suicides. They want to see women treated better. They want to see those who question their faith not be marginalized and punished. Like, they want all the same things, Bert, that you and I want.
Yeah,
right?
sure. Yeah. But let's be clear about something. I think a lot of right-wing people want those things too. And they feel like, okay, the way we can, and, you know, the way that women can be treated better is if we could just take them all out of the workplace, right? Like, the way that, you know, society would be safer is if we just brought back prohibition, which I literally heard like a Mormon, you know, scholar say a couple weeks ago. You know, so it's hard to be against like things that are so obviously good. But the question is, they want these things very privately, and then they want it publicly up to a point of challenging the church. But beyond that point, they'll go beyond that point privately, right? They'll share like their
Spencer
opinions.
did in this private
I guess
exchange.
so. Yeah.
With the Millers.
But publicly, it's like you have a sense of where you will not go past, right?
Now, what's wrong with that? What if someone were to say, well, they're just being diplomatic. They're just being smart. They're keeping their job. They're fighting from within.
Yeah.
Why would you critique that?
Well,
what might the critique be of that? If they're fighting for the same things we are, they're just trying to keep their job and use their influence from within, versus they would say a Bert or a John DeLynn doesn't have influence because they're outside and they're dismissed.
Okay. So two things. Number one, I think it's totally fine. From a progressivist model, if you want to help change an institution, there needs to be pressure from the inside and from the outside. That's cool. I'm down with that. But the other thing, and this is the thing that gets me super uncomfortable and super unhappy, is that if they truly, if the internal people and the external people really do want the same thing, when the external people start doing stuff, why did the internal people come and attack us or discredit us, or, you know, say why we shouldn't listen to you because you're not a real scholar, or we shouldn't listen to you because you're just a podcaster, or, you know, like stuff like that. Like, that's not particularly helpful, I don't feel. And so either we really do want the same thing and we're just like working like at odds with one another, or we don't, which would seem like a more reasonable assumption, I think. And so what I want is very different from what they want, and I'm explicit about it, okay? And so that's my critique. Now, I will say, I'm not saying everyone needs to feel the way that I feel. I think, you know, you think about it yourself, you consider what you want to feel invested in, you do that. But just because you keep the kid gloves on and no longer behave like a ferocious animal, the way maybe some traditional apologetics at times did, just because you keep the kid gloves on doesn't mean that I have to. So, yeah.
So some of the examples might be Ordained Women, Mormon Stories podcast,
right. Oh, here,
CES letter.
Let's go through all of these. Okay, so when Ordained Women happens, Valerie Hudson Katzler publishes a long like this is really silly. Like, why are these women doing this, right? And she's supposed to be like a feminist or something like that. And so I mean, theoretically, she and Kate Kelly want similar things in sense of like, we want the church to be more feminist friendly, or I don't know. Like, that's at the level of, you know, abstraction. But then the people who actually try to make the church more like open to women or whatever, the commissar class, if you will, these liberal scholars and whatnot, have to prove that when something controversial happens, they are on the right side of the line. and say they will not attack the power structure. They will attack the people who are trying to make the church or wherever more habitable for more people.
So Kate Kelly and ordained women is one example.
Yeah.
How about Jeremy Runnels?
Well,
because there are scholars that are very snooty, very disrespectful to Jeremy's work.
I think Jeremy, the clearest kind of problem I see with the quote liberal apologists response to Jeremy Runnels is that they just completely ignore it. I feel that, I mean,
they sometimes ignore it, or they dismiss it as poor scholarship.
I don't think they engage it at all. And it's kind of like, I can understand why you don't want to, but at the same time, if what you say is you care about people, their faith, and their interaction with the church and everything like that, to ignore the CES letter, like, it would be more important to read the CES letter than it would to read the Book of Mormon, honestly. Like, as far as, all of these people who are on the edge or on the fence about their faith or whatever, most of these people are not going to read like a verse in the Book of Mormon and be like, oh, thank you, that solved my problem. It's like they're going to be concerned with that. And so if you just like, pass him aside because you're like, oh, he's not worth taking seriously. These other folks aren't going to buy that, right? They're just going to be like, that just feels a bit, it's kind of a dumb word, but elitist, So, yeah.
Okay. So what are some of your other concerns with, so they don't speak out enough. They throw under the bus those who...
Let me be clear. Let me clarify that. I don't have a standard for them that they need to speak out about like so much. I'm just saying they seem to present themselves as trying to fix things or solve problems or whatever. And so I find it a little bizarre when they seem to contribute to the problem rather than alleviate the problem. That's what I...
And how do they do that?
Well, like, okay, when Patrick Mason speaks at Fair, and I think you said this to me, this was like a year or two ago, you're like, this is revolutionary for Fair. And it is, it's true. Patrick Mason says, I don't want to see what happens in our church, what happened in the Southern Baptist Convention in the 90s, where there was a fundamentalist takeover. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm like, okay, here's a guy who says like he's an expert in studying religion. I assume that that's like his job, right? I think he knows what fundamentalism means. And when you kind of compare American religious factions, whether it's Mormon or Jehovah's Witness or various strands of evangelical or whatever, and you compare these against mainline Protestant, you're like, we are a fundamentalist religion. So it's, again, goes back to that presupposition thing. If you say, I don't want to see a fundamentalist takeover of our church, you presuppose that it hasn't already happened or that it hasn't always been this way. And so I find that misleading.
You're saying we're objectively fundamentalist.
I don't know about the word objectively, but it seems from like a sociological or anthropological perspective, yeah, we're religiously. For what that word means.
So it was deceptive, you're saying, a little bit.
Well, and he might be making that deception unknowingly, or he might just disagree with me, but I reserve the right to disagree with him.
Yeah.
Right? So, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So when you think about, what do you think about this idea, just speaking very concretely, when Spencer's talking to this Miller couple and he's saying things like Joseph Smith, inspired eclecticism, that he's just this sponge that's looking around him.
Yeah.
And he's, Masonry, and there's King James, and there's View of the Hebrews, and he's just... that somehow that number one, that's what he's doing. They're admitting that. And then that it's somehow beautiful and inspiring that's the process. That in some ways that's more inspiring and faithful than actual translation. And he gives those sorts of answers to people in private.
Yeah.
What's your...
well, if he feels that way, I think it's a subjective experience and he's welcome to it. I don't feel that way.
Why'd you laugh so hard though?
Well, because it's kind of like the Sizzler approach. It's like, we got Italian, we got, Mexican, we got, all of these different things. We got all the desserts. Bring your kids. There's room for everybody. And I'm just like, no, look, okay. The thing that was very disappointing for me once I started studying, in my PhD, I'm studying medieval Christianity. And I come to realize Mormons are not Christian from like the normal usages of those words, okay? And I can hear a kind of postmodern monkey in my brain saying, how dare you say normal usages of those words, you know? But Mormons weren't Christian. I was like, okay, well, I've always worshiped Jesus and Christ and stuff like that. The Book of Mormon is a very Jesus-heavy book. What am I? What is Mormon? And as I look into just about everything, I realize we're not anything unique or particular. We are an amalgamation of a lot of things, right? And that can be good, but when a lot of those things that are brought into the hodgepodge are like awful and toxic, and you want to like get rid of those.
Like what?
Well, I mean, like the race thing, or hating
the
the
racism,
gays, or
the homophobia.
yeah, the patriarchy stuff, and the secretive nature, So you kind of want to look at
commercialism.
This stuff. Yeah, I mean, I'm not crazy about that myself. Yeah. If what you're saying is we're good because, or like Joseph is good because he brought all this stuff together, but then you look at Joseph and you're like, well, there's some stuff I don't like. Your response can either be, well, maybe I need to change my opinion about the goodness or badness of those things, or maybe I should even question the reality of what is good or what is true or whatever. Or your response would be like, well, I don't like these bits, and so I think Joseph was wrong here, or whatever, and speak about this publicly. That's another thing you can't do. It's just be like, nope, that's wrong. And so then you take it off, and then you're kind of like damaging the idea that what's so beautiful is that he brought all these things together, if you find value in taking some of those things out. And so, like I say, if somebody feels that way, of course, they're welcome to it, but I don't think it's if they feel it subjectively and they're just expressing this is how I feel, that's fine. But if they're saying like, this is how I feel, and I think it's a serious position that is where you maybe ought to consider feeling that yourself, I think it's kind of ridiculous. So, yeah.
What about, when the Millers are trying to decide whether or not to use Spencer Fluben's name, whether or not to mention the Maxwell Institute, whether or not to release the audio and or the transcript of their conversation with Spencer, there were a lot of people who expressed concern to me privately. Don't do that. Spencer's one of the good guys. He gave these conversations in secret and private. He didn't know he knew he was being recorded, but he didn't give permission.
Yeah.
And you're going to hurt him. There are all sorts of enemies like, Midgley and Peterson that are still out there nipping at the heels of the Maxwell Institute and Spencer. And all you're giving them is ammo to hurt Spencer. By the way, if Spencer's in there trying to do good, if you speak publicly about him or what they're trying to do, it could compromise his power and his influence. So leave him alone, basically.
Okay.
What would your response to that be? Even to the Miller's choice of naming him, as the person that they spoke with, when they got these answers that for them were just not satisfactory.
Yeah. So I don't feel in this instance like playing the morality referee, but the way I feel is kind of like, if they do something and he doesn't like it and he has good reasons not to like it, that's not, they can still do what they're going to do.
You said something to me at Taco Bell about in an authoritative organization, who says something is actually all that matters.
Yeah.
So in other words, the fact that Spencer sits as the chair of the Maxwell Institute and is giving these really neo-apologetic answers like the brethren are flawed, revelation comes from the grassroots. Yeah. Inspired eclecticism, the Book of Mormon does contain forgeries. It is plagiarized from the New Testament. These are very significant things, mainly because he's saying them.
That's
and he's sitting in the institution he is. Now I'm telling you what to say, but I got that from you.
Yeah, no, that's true. No, that is true. So, like I say, the kind of a classical distinction between right wing and left wing is that right wing is who says the thing is what matters more than what is being said, right? And in a left wing perspective, what is being said matters more. And the church is definitely, without doubt, a right-wing institution. BYU is certainly, and all universities are certainly, some more than less, but authoritarian institutions. I mean, there's no doubt about that. I don't think. And so if the way you unmask it is to catch the difference between the PR machine, the propaganda engine, and what is actually said behind closed doors. I mean, okay, if somebody's going to say that's like ethically ambiguous or something like that, then they also consider investigative journalism ethically ambiguous. And I find the institution of investigative journalism morally very clear. It seems very clear that it's a good thing. Now, if you want to take certain things on a case-by-case basis and kind of judge and weigh them, if you want to say somebody like Edward Snowden is more ethical than somebody like Julian Assange, it's like, okay, those are kind of more subtle distinctions that we can talk about and discuss. But if you'd want to say that, like, people shouldn't even be doing that at all, like, that seems really wrong to me. That seems really, really wrong to me.
So you have these families, these couples like the Millers, where let's just say the husband loses his faith, but the wife believes. And so for years, the husband's suffering in silence, being disrespected by the wife, being disrespected by extended family. Maybe the marriage is frayed and on the rocks. And maybe there's just deep stress and tension that's spilling out all over, that's kind of breaking up families.
Is that what was happening in their situation? I'm
sure.
sorry, I wish I could have listened to it. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So then they go to the wizard, they go to Spencer to get sort of this last ditch. Like Brooke finds out, she starts studying. She's like, oh my gosh, these issues are legitimate. We've been lied to. So then they go to Spencer and they say, help us. And then Spencer gives these sort of neo-apologetic, what is truth? It's all messy. Yeah. The brethren are just figuring out like us. They stand short. We need to forgive them just like they need to forgive us. Revolution inspiration can often come, through peer pressure. He said that peer pressure can often be the impetus for a revelation. He admits that the brethren are often 30 years behind the times on major social issues. These are all things he's saying to them privately. Yeah. Is there any problem with that? Or is that a good thing?
Okay, I'll put it this way. Because I have close relationships to people at the Maxwell Institute, I don't have a close relationship with Spencer. He knows who I am. I know who he is, but I wasn't working there when he was there. I feel like my personal opinion about this will be like I'm too close to the issue, I guess. Now, if you were to ask me this same question about somebody like Mike Norton and him going into temples and recording it, Sandra Tanner said she wouldn't do that herself. I applaud Mike Norton for doing what he's doing. Okay. Now that's going to be an unpopular opinion, I think, but I'm totally behind it. Now, in an abstract way, totally. I think this couple you're talking about, I would never criticize them for what they did. I would never.
And I'm actually not talking about that. I'm asking about, is there any problem with neo-apologists, number one, having
I misunderstood.
Having a second unofficial narrative?
Oh, yeah, I think there's a problem.
I want you to talk about that. What's the problem with number one? Yeah. A second unofficial postmodern narrative.
Yeah.
And that they're only willing to share it selectively in private or in these secret firesides.
Yeah. So
what are the problems with that?
So there was this book called The American Religion, written by a fellow at Yale, Harold Bloom, that I don't think most Mormons liked, but some people do. Mike Quinn liked it. Margaret Toscano likes it. I like it. And he talks about the American religion more broadly, but Mormonism being the best example of this. He talks about it as being Gnostic. And there are problems with his characterization, but one thing that is really clarifying is Gnostics believe in a kind of secret gospel. Okay, so in order to be saved, you have to know like the hidden knowledge. And the word Gnostic, it has the same root as to know. That's just what the word comes from in Greek. And so I find it extraordinarily problematic for somebody to champion himself as a leader of transparency, which I get the impression Spencer does, and then to also simultaneously be a Gnostic, if he is that. I'm just using this as a way of, exploring this idea of saying, well, there's kind of this truth, but once you get closer to the inner sanctum, there's this truth. Which is why I found that Tom Phillips interview with you so unsettling, and I'm really glad he did it, is because it's like, wait a second. My whole life I'm told that I'm supposed to be sealed to my spouse in the temple, and this is the crowning ordinance. And I hear that verbiage from, I don't know, people like John By the Way or whatever at EFYs and those sorts of things. And then I learned there's actually one on top of that. Now, I don't have a problem with there being one on top of it, but the fact that they have their own little like private salvation process is like really like religiously offensive, I feel. And I think that the idea of having scholars who say one thing in their books, but they feel something different in private, and they're working on this behind closed door type network, they would call me gossipy, right? They would call me gossipy for shedding light on this stuff. But for them, that's just normal. That's just how you survive in this institution. That's not gossip, apparently. And so I have a huge problem with, how could it not feel somewhat duplicitous if in private, you're willing to say to somebody that, I don't know the Millers' relationship with Spencer Fluman. I don't know how well they know each other. But I know from personal experience that professors that don't know certain people even all that well, they're willing to say things in private to people they don't even know that well. And things that they would never say on a blog or on a podcast or whatever. It's kind of like, I don't know. We all have that. And this is a line I do like from Neil A. Maxwell. I read in one of his books, the idea of reducing hypocrisy in our lives. Because I do feel like we are hypocrites in the sense that our values and our words and our actions don't always line up with how they ought to be. But I feel like it's wrong to defend a practice which would increase hypocrisy in people's lives. That doesn't seem, Did I respond to the question better?
Sure.
Okay.
The other, and this is just me again restating what I said last episode with the Millers. When Josh Miller is left for years to suffer in silence, or his marriage is threatened, because everyone around him, all the traditional Orthodox believing Mormons, are marching in step with the official narrative. But then when it's time for him and his wife to sort of seek support, they're given this unofficial postmodern neo-apologetic narrative just to assuage the few liberals that might be questioning or fraying from the church. It seems like it sacrifices on the altar tens or hundreds of thousands of families.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And so, okay. Something you'll hear again and again and again in these circles is all the terrible things that families will do to each other, like what you just described. And they say, oh, well, they don't know the real gospel. They don't really know the teachings of the church. Otherwise, they wouldn't have done those things, which is another kind of Gnostic move, right? Like, oh, we really get it, but they don't get it. And you're like, well, if we're just looking at it statistically, demographically, of people who are active in the church and everything like this, and this is actually more common than whatever weird intellectual stuff you do, then wouldn't they be the normative? And you would be the exception? And so they have to play the tightrope not just of keeping people in, but they have to play the tightrope of not displaying exactly who in private, a lot of times, they claim to be. Because if so doing, then people would say, right? Like, how dare the church employ, like in this Tara Westover book, is it called Educated? I've been listening to it on Audible. And her dad always talks about the socialist professors at BYU, right? Like, how dare the church pay people that have liberal ideas at BYU and all this stuff. And so you can't megaphone that. You megaphone that, you get the axe, because it causes problems for the church and for you and your standing in your local community or whatever. Yeah.
I'm getting 2 criticisms from Jerry Renshaw, who is always so good to tune in. She's one of the main moderators for Thoughtful Faith. First of all, she's saying that one of the problems with the Miller interview is that they agreed not to share the interview. And that's true, and they didn't share the interview. What they did is they talked about the interview. So, Jerry, my understanding is that the Millers agreed not to share the recording, which they didn't, outside of their private, friends and whoever they wanted to share it with. But they never agreed with Spencer to not talk about the things that Spencer said to them. So my understanding is they did not violate their agreement with Spencer, and to infer that they did violate their agreement with Spencer, I think, is to misunderstand what they've said and to read more into the situation.
Can
would
I
it be
respond to
fair?
that?
Would it be fair for Spencer to say, "I'm going to give you all these answers sitting at BYU in the Maxwell, but don't tell anyone I told you this"?
Well, and this is what I was going to say is let's say they broke their word completely and shared the interview. Okay. That is something of a moral crisis, I guess. But I think it's very small by comparison to this bigger problem that we're talking about, which is this double narrative idea, right? Like, the people who the church is literally employing to help, like, shore the tide of folks leaving, apparently, in many cases, believe pretty different things privately than what they are willing to talk about publicly.
And certainly very different than what's taught at General Conference. And
the official. I mean, like, without a doubt.
So it's like almost two different churches,
yeah,
right?
because if you look at like, and I'm not saying the church should be all uniform, right? But because that contingent is so small within the church, they feel like, you know, their positions of power are very threatened, and they need to be afraid because they should. But if you look at something like Letters to a Young Mormon, last I heard, I'm sure because it has a second edition now, but when I heard a couple years ago, it had sold like 9,000 copies, which if you're an academic and you sell more than like 500 copies of a book, that's amazing. But Letters to a Young Mormon was not an academic book, and it was distributed by the church's own book company and all of this stuff. And you're just like, it's just not that much. When you look at the numbers for the first volume of the Joseph Smith paper, this is documentary record, okay? I think it sold, like, in its first year, like 60 or 70,000 copies, okay? When you compare these things, and it's not, people don't even read that book, but they just know, like, they care about it because it's Joseph Smith and the church is publishing it. Whereas some, like, little, kind of more liberal type publication to help people with faith crises, it's like the overall church just their way of dealing with is just to ignore it, just ignore all of that. So, yeah. But they did it for so many generations that did I hear you quote Marlon Jensen saying that the church is losing the best and brightest? And that, so when you have a brain drain like that, I mean, who's going to be the next donor class? Now there are, right-wing millennials, but overall they seem very progressive, just as a generation, it seems. So, yeah.
A second thing Jerry Lee wrote was a concern that we're making it look like Spencer has a second set of beliefs. He's got sort of public beliefs and private beliefs.
No, he has cognitive dissonance, which, I mean, I had too. So
when I was able to listen to the recording and read the transcript.
Yeah.
And I got the sense that Spencer was very secure in where he was.
Okay, maybe that's unfair. I shouldn't say that.
But I will say that what was the second narrative that I heard isn't him being fractured in his beliefs. It's him being willing to say things in private, like revelation comes through peer pressure. Yeah. Revelation through peer pressure. Yeah. Brethren, 30 years behind the times. The church being wrong on the LGBT issue. This whole idea of inspired eclecticism, where Joseph plagiarizes from the New Testament for the Book of Abraham and for the Book of Mormon. Yeah. I doubt that he's willing to say these things in a commencement speech at BYU.
Can you imagine?
or in his public speeches at Fair, or wherever he would talk.
And
that's the double narrative that I'm talking about.
And my knee-jerk reaction to say that he has cognitive dissonance, I now feel that was unfair to say. I shouldn't have said that. So I feel like I
it's fine.
mischaracterized.
That's fine. I'm just sort of I'm just trying to make it sure we understand what we are and aren't saying.
Yeah.
So we've got this Neo-Apologetics thing now. Bushman's running around. Givens is running around. Mason's running around. Spencer Fluman's doing his thing. Are there any other, is it good? Is it bad? Are there any other thoughts you have about it before we kind of wrap up?
I don't know.
You kind of tired?
Yeah, no.
Did I wear you out?
It's just like, it gets to a point where you stop caring,
What does it mean for the church that this is clearly the direction they're going? They're still maintaining the official narrative, but they're slowly...
I don't know that they are clearly going this direction.
Well, Terrell Givens had 3 book contracts with Deseret Book.
Okay, but look at all of the books that are at Deseret Book. They're not... It's not... okay,
So
Deseret
it's
Book
not a
is
direction you're saying.
maybe. I mean,
It's just
maybe
like
it's more of like an outgrowth or something.
It's just like a rifle. Like,
but in terms of like steering the old ship Zion, this big oil tanker, and we were going to the North Pole, but now we're going to the South Pole, and we're turning around to go that direction. That doesn't seem like what's going on.
okay.
Yeah.
So you don't. So does this matter? Does Neo-Apologetics matter?
I think it matters a lot to the people who are involved with it, sure. But
Does it matter to, is there a net positive or negative good that you, or bad that you see happening to the people impacted by Mormonism?
I don't know. I wouldn't know how to do that math, I guess.
It's complex math.
Yeah. No, I mean, where I'm at now, because I am, thinking a lot about a career in academia and the bleakness of that prospect. And so I am just reading what I want, lots of different things. And lately, because I never really learned much about it, I've been studying up on the Israel-Palestine conflict, which has been going on a long time. And I wasn't expecting this. It just happened that so many of the rhetorical moves, the false directions, the garden paths, the non sequiturs, the ad hominems, so much of this stuff happens in the discussion of Israeli apologetics. And that's like the same as in Mormon apologetics. Like, it blew my mind that we're all using the same tools for these different causes. But when I started learning about, Gaza or the, Palestinian rights or the lack thereof, I realized that, okay, they're using the same discursive tools, but the stakes are so much higher when it comes to that conflict than they are in Mormonism. Now, Mormonism has some serious stuff, like, it matters if your family kind of ices you out and isolates you and everything like that. That matters. It matters that people are killing themselves. That matters, okay? I'm not saying those things don't matter. But it's just like when Joseph Smith started the church and where he lived was sort of a backwater of what's going on in the world. I oftentimes feel that's what Mormonism is. I like it in the sense of this is what I grew up with. It's the language that I speak. It's always going to be a part of me till I die. But I have a hard time focusing all my time, energy, and attention on it the way that I once did.
Sure.
Yeah.
That makes sense. I'm just going to, and I obviously could have, I had my faith crisis in 2001. So that's like 17 years ago.
Yeah.
And this is now like the 13th year of Mormon Stories. I could have left it behind a long time ago. It's really...
I will say, however, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I love what you're doing. I don't feel like I could create what you have created, and what Open Stories Foundation seems to me worth growing and continuing. I mean, I donate. I donate to the OSF. I mean, you saved me a ton of money on tithing. And so, it's like I'm paying, very little money to you guys. I'm helping you with this book project that we got coming out. I'm happy to be kind of like a sideliner and everything like that. And in a way, I'm a little jealous that you can have this level of commitment to something that I really agree with, and I like what you're doing. So I don't have a problem with it. That's not a judgment
I appreciate
from me.
that.
Yeah.
No, I just want to tell you what keeps me going, and I'm curious if you agree. When you think about any major issue, whether it's gun control, poverty, women's rights, abortion rights, environmentalism, right? Mm-hmm. Arab-Israeli conflict, pick, even Trump, or Obama or whatever, food, whatever the political issue is. Yeah. I think about, are there underpinning philosophies or worldviews that either make someone very rigid to learning new views, or that literally bolster those worldviews that may not be
I see what you're saying.
helpful.
Yeah.
And so from my point of view, and that we got this from Tara Westover, it was like, I asked her, how do you go from like not being educated in public schools, not knowing basic math, to freaking a PhD at Cambridge?
Yeah.
And she says, I got introduced to other worldviews. And other worldviews were transformative for her.
That's right.
In helping her become what was one of the most conservative sort of coming from one of the most conservative fundamentalist frameworks to one that I think would maybe make the world a much better place if more people followed.
Yeah.
And it's the disentangling of toxic or unhealthy or unrealistic or ill-founded or even some cases fraudulent worldviews that are the binding forces to all these other political concerns that you might really care about.
So
is that possible or not?
Yes and no. So I want to be very this idea of other worldviews is very traditionally a left-wing value. It's the idea of imagination, and if you can imagine something other than what you've experienced or seen and then reconstitute organizations according to those things, I think that that's very valuable. But coming from a leftist perspective, as I am, something that you have to acknowledge, which is problematic, is becoming deeply ideological, in the sense that unless you have the right ideas, you are an enemy to the cause. And that just has not been my life experience. I feel like a lot of people with a lot of wrong ideas oftentimes are doing things better than people who aren't. Like in the 80s, a lot of right-wing churches were very instrumental in reporting on the Reagan administration war crimes in Latin America. And why they did it or why they didn't do it, I couldn't really say. But I felt like they were doing something that mattered. And so I believe in education. You know, I planned my whole life to be an educator primarily. And I think that absolutely should be a core value to introduce people. But something I do not believe that education is just teaching, saying like, okay, I've kind of learned the right ideas, and now it's my turn to like kind of download it into your young mind so that you can understand that. I think it's important to present these ideas and not be nihilistic about it or kind of cynical where you say, well, it's all relative or something like that. But to present these different ideas, to have your own convictions, to be able to defend your convictions, but not to expect your students to necessarily line up with your convictions. And unless they do, you'll punish them. Right.
No, of course.
Right. Yeah.
But
I have to say this, not because it's a problem for Mormons. It's not. I have to say this because it's been a problem historically in leftist thought, like over the last century or more, is that unless you are willing to toe a party line, then you need to be punished. So that's why I'm saying it, not because of you.
Sure. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And the only point I'm making to summarize is there a chance that fundamentalist religion historically has bound people to all sorts of political and social ideologies?
Yeah, that's true.
That we would do better to part from.
Yeah, but I think there's also fundamentalist political ideologies as well. And so escaping from a fundamentalist religious worldview does not necessarily give you an eject button from a fundamentalist political worldview. So I'm personally not a fundamentalist in the sense of like we've been talking, the religious sense, but there is this kind of philosophical idea of foundationalism, which I do find quite compelling. So I mean, they use very similar words, but I see them being quite different. Yeah.
Really quickly, I always you have the postmodern voice in your head.
Well, yeah, I mean, you hear it so many years.
I have the Dan Witherspoon voice in my head that's always reminding me, John, you're putting up a false narrative. He basically says that, you don't evaluate religion with the tools of science. Religion is a totally different category. You're making a categorical error when you try and hold it up to intellectual scrutiny. And he makes the argument that religion is about the work of soul forging. It's becoming more moral. It's serving more. It's becoming more spiritual. And this whole thing about is it true and is it historical, and even if it does harm or not, he would argue, kind of like Eugene England did, that engagement with a religion makes you a deeper and a wiser and a more spiritual person.
Okay, I think that's true. And not in the sense that you need to go to church on every Sunday and you need to pay your tithing or say your prayers every day or anything like that. But to write religion off is very foolish, I think. It's something that needs to be taken very seriously. But if the idea of religion is to let somebody be more in the mind or in the mode of a Dan Witherspoon or a Eugene England or whatever, these people are so rare that world religions are a colossal failure if this is their purported aim. Yeah.
But Dan basically, his angle on life is don't leave Mormonism.
Oh,
stay in Mormonism.
Okay. I mean,
no,
leave it or don't. Like, yeah.
But he said, so if I'm Dan and I'm saying, Bert,
yeah,
stay in Mormonism. Stay.
Why?
It'll make you richer spiritually. It'll make you wiser.
He can't
It'll
claim
make
that.
you more kind. It'll make you more compassionate.
No, not necessarily.
It'll make you a better person.
No.
It's a...
I mean, like, it's just not true. I mean, it might, but it's not guaranteed.
No, but he's saying it's got a better shot than just going off and doing your own thing. Like,
why? What? How can he claim this? I mean, and Dan and I, we talk from time to time. I quite like it, but I mean, is this literally what he claims? I've never heard him claim quite this.
Okay, I'm going to be putting words in his mouth,
oh, okay.
But I think that's what I understand the Mormon Matters podcast to be all about. It's basically saying there's a cheap, flimsy, false categorical Mormonism, which is it true or not?
Yeah.
And if it's not true,
which is the one that most Mormons like active Mormons are like into, right? So they don't have the real gospel or something.
That's the superficial, false narrative, sort of false dichotomy Mormonism that Dan
the general
rejects.
Authorities seem to believe.
That Dan would agree. Dan would agree.
Yeah.
But he's basically saying there's a deeper, richer experience that religion facilitates. And I think Dan would say more often than going off on your own. He would say you've got a highest probability of becoming your best self through staying in the religion and having it teach you deep, spiritual, enriching things through engagement.
Okay.
But why isn't that compelling to you?
Why is it not?
Yeah.
Okay, number one, which religion?
Okay, Mormonism, because it's the tribe you grew up in.
Okay. Well, what if the tribe you grew up in abused you? So
that's hard.
Okay, yeah.
But hard things happen.
Well, and I don't mean abuse in like a strict legal sense. I mean in other ways, humiliation, embarrassment, that sort of a thing. The gaslighting we've been talking about. And so if something is your native tongue, just because something is your native tongue doesn't mean that you're bound by your birth to die in it. That's a very Mormon idea, sure. That's a Mormon way of thinking, but I don't think there's anything that necessitates that. The next is religion. Why should religion pull a lot of your attention and focus? I mean, there are other things that you can focus on as well, that you belong to a group, that you're trying to do good, and all of this other stuff. So
it gives you an identity, it gives you a morality, it gives you a source for spirituality, it gives you a chance to serve, it gives you a community, it gives you solace about the afterlife, it resolves many of the existential concerns, and it gives you adversity that helps you become stronger.
Yeah. Adversity is something that just exists. It's never something I'm looking for more of. But I don't understand, like it's not even coherent to me that Mormonism or a major religion would have monopolies on any of these things that you just listed. Like that I just don't even follow, So, yeah.
So for you don't feel like there's an advantage to staying engaged with the religious tradition?
I mean, there might be, but I don't.
Bert.
I mean, there might be,
but for you,
for me personally, no. I don't think so. Like,
how are you going to become a good person, Bert?
Yeah. So I'll go to Community of Christ. They meet in Provo twice a month, and I'll go maybe once a month but for me, primarily, what I care about is that churches offer a social space where you interact with folks that you don't normally get to in your work or in your family or something like that. And so I just like interacting with people. But I go to Community of Christ. They have their apostle there. They're talking about Jesus. And I ask the question, like, what makes Jesus special? Like, I don't get it. Could you explain this to me? And they were like super generous. And they were like, yeah, like, I mean, it's because it's my native tongue. And I was like, well, Christianity is not my native tongue. I'm Mormon. So why should I learn this other tongue instead of Islam or Baha'i or, whatever? Like, why, like, the thing about religion, I really feel, in the idea of kind of the hero's journey and the myth quest, is that you feel drawn to it, right? You feel this call to it. And if you don't have that, I don't think there's anything wrong with you. In some ways, I feel like you're lucky, So I don't feel like the burden another person feels called to bear, part of that burden is convincing other people that they should also feel the burden or also feel that calling. Maybe. Don't know.
Got it.
Yeah, it's just not in my bones.
So for you, it's not. So where are you now, religion-wise, faith-wise?
So religion is largely an intellectual thing for me, meaning it's something I think and read about, but it's also a community thing in that it affects the lives of literally every single person that I know and that I interact with. And so to me, I'll hang out with, there's this group I like to call the high priests. They'll meet at Jim's family diner or whatever in Riverton once a month, and I'll go, and all of them are active LDS, all of them. Okay. But I go to talk with them, and oftentimes we talk about religion, but I don't do it because we're talking about Mormonism. I do it because I like them. Okay. And this is the thing, right? When we come back to the ideas, I don't gravitate towards other people because they have the same ideas as me. I gravitate towards them because I like them, or I don't. And us having the same ideas is not going to predetermine either of those outcomes. So, as far as my beliefs and religion go, I really enjoy entertaining like really heretical, bizarre ideas, like going to remnant groups, you know what I'm talking, the
Snuffer.
Yeah. I mean, he's definitely a key player. But going to remnant groups, hearing their logic applied to the president of the church, and then I don't do it at the group because it maybe is not appropriate to do so. I don't know. But I just apply that same logic that they apply to the presidency of the church and the authoritarianism. I apply it to God. I'm like, so what's the difference? Like, God is in the office of godhood, and just because he's in that, or she or they or whatever are in that office, they get to just say stuff and you just have to be obedient with it. And they're like, oh no, well, God will reason with you. It's like, okay, but in terms of reasoning with me, I can understand sometimes I would come to his position, his way of seeing things, but other times, what if I didn't? Do I just get punished? It's like, how's that any different than being in the LDS church and praying about the November 5th policy and just praying and praying and praying until you get the right answer, It's like, I don't find that compelling. So I'm serious about this. I've been looking into different kinds of Satanism or paganism or things like that, because largely they're not what they are portrayed to be. They tend to be very secular. They tend to be very political in orientation. They tend to be very imaginative and creative and artistic. And so I'm curious about those things. I'll look into them. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
All right.
Yeah.
So are you happier now than you were before? Are you glad you went through this faith transition?
Yeah.
Are you happier, healthier out of the church than in? Do you even have a...
So I heard John Larson once say on a podcast that he estimated for every year of your life in the church, you would have, and once you've left, you've got to spend about a month leaving the church, if you will. And so far, that's felt pretty accurate. I mean, I was in the church for 28 months. 28 years. I've been out of the church about, 15, 16 months. And I definitely feel it's kind of like getting better each day. But those first 8, 9 months, man, that was some brutal stuff. I had to take time off for my PhD, right? Because my entire worldview was cratering. And, yeah, it's very hard. It's very difficult. I saw a psychologist. I thought that was very helpful. So I don't, my wife is a better barometer as to my happiness level because she has to deal with whether I'm grumpy or not. She tells me I'm happier now than I was like 12 months ago. So we'll go off what she says, but I don't really pay too much attention to that myself. Yeah.
But overall, do you feel better about where you are? Do
Yeah,
you feel
absolutely.
satisfied out of the church?
Yeah, absolutely, for sure. Yeah. But I mean, like in the church, I didn't feel particularly dissatisfied until I started learning all the stuff that I was like, whoa, wait a second. And then I had about a 2-month period where I was trying to be more like of an outreach, help people. And then I felt very uncomfortable in the church. And so then I left. Yeah. But. Mm-hmm.
So if you were to share with the audience any closing thoughts about life or your worldview or your perspective, any advice or just wisdom or feelings, what would you share?
So I really like reading books by anarchists, and I like a lot of it. I think it's really good. I think that anti-authoritarianism is very good. Anti-authority is a different sort of a thing. I think authority ought to be respected where it's genuine. I started becoming very concerned about just the state of society and any of the millions of things that could go very, very wrong. And then after I kind of learned a lot of these different issues, I decided, well, I can't focus on all of them. Let me just focus on one first. And so I've been focusing a lot more on environmentalism, which I care a lot about. And so my wife and I we eat vegan, and I walk to work because I'm able to. I understand that other people are not in that position to do so. But as far as beliefs and things like that, I've really had to wrestle with a lot of right-wing ideas that I was never exposed to in my university classes, that I felt it's good that I wrestle with these. I kind of a guiding philosophy for me the past few months. And it's very simple and very unexciting, which normally I'm not into this, but I read The One Thing by Gary Keller. So I work with Keller Williams Real Estate, and he's the president or CEO or something. And I really try to guide my life according to that principle, which could be, it basically means rather than trying to master things simultaneously, just pick one thing, focus on it, and master things sequentially. And so I'm working a lot at my job, and, just trying to have some fun. I think having fun is really important. I feel like I don't have any grand wisdom or anything though to impart.
In your job, you're a real estate agent helping people buy and sell homes, or what?
Yeah, so I am a licensed agent and I can do that, but I spend most of my time handling logistics and operations for our team, just making sure we spend money in the right place, or we market this or that or whatever. And it's a blast. It really is so much fun. And you know what? Half the people on the team are very active LDS. They're raising their kids that way because this is in Orem, Utah. The other half are not. Well, I don't know if it's fully half, but a chunk of them are ex-LDS or whatever. And, we get along fine. We're having fun. And I really see this as a desirable situation. Just, we don't let religion get in the way of our lives. But religion is something there, and we don't try to ignore it either. Yeah.
All right. Well, Bert, it's been really fun to have you on Mormon Stories podcast. I really respect your intellect and your wisdom, especially you're so freaking young.
Hey, I turned 30 this week.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So now you're old. Never
yeah,
mind.
now I'm old.
You're super old.
Now I got to do my Jesus thing, right? The ministry or whatever. Yeah.
No, but thank you for coming on. Thank you for sharing your thoughts, your experiences. And I hope you'll come back and give us analysis another time as well.
Okay. Well, thanks for having me, John. And, I like you. You seem like a good guy to me from what I can tell.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. So,
thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks,
So, and I don't, the people that I've criticized in this podcast, most of them I do not dislike personally. Almost all of them I like at a personal level. But when you're a public figure, literally publishing things, you're putting it out there in the public forum for people to discuss and to weigh and to critique and everything like that. And so I feel like each of us has a responsibility to be involved in that sort of a thing. I'm happy to do it.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank all our listeners for tuning in today. All the people who commented or asked questions. It means a lot. I want to thank the Millers for their willingness to share their experiences with Spencer Fluman, the Maxwell Institute, and all the people who participated in this sort of series on neo-apologetics, including Jackson Washburn and John Ogden and Tom Christofferson and just everyone
Patrick
Mason, and Lloyd. Mm-hmm. It's been a really good series. I think we're kind of winding it to a close.
Yeah.
But I just think it's been important to talk about these things, and it's going to be interesting to see how that all shakes out in the long run, how it affects the church, whether it's going to stem the tide, whether it increases and accelerates people's disaffection, whether it weakens the church or strengthens the church. We don't know, but I think it's important to observe it and to talk about it and to note it, because I think Mormonism matters to a lot of people. It affects a lot of lives.
Yeah, it does.
And so kind of calling things and talking about it, I think it's useful. So thanks to everyone who supports us. Thanks to everyone who donates to the Open Stories Foundation, Mormon Stories podcast. Your donations make all this possible. If you really do value this work, there's lots of ways you can support us. One is to make a donation. Go to mormonstories.org, click on the donate button in the top right. $10, $20, $50, $100 a month.
And can I say just briefly,
Yes.
like anybody that Mormon Stories played a major role in your decision to no longer be actively engaged in the LDS church, and if you were a tithing payer before, I feel like, myself, I felt a moral responsibility to support this institution financially, which is why I donate monthly. Because on the one hand, it was great financially that I saved so much money in tithing dollars, but I just started off with $10 a month, and just I hope as I make more money, I can give more money to you guys. So
Thank you.
Sorry to interrupt, but I feel
Thank you.
there is a kind of moral obligation that we owe all the work that's gone into all of this through all the years. So yeah.
Thank you. You said it. In addition to supporting us financially, check out our events. You can go to mormonstories.org/events. We've got upcoming events, retreats, and workshops to support people in their religious transitions. Coming up in Salt Lake, in Houston, in Idaho Falls. We're looking to do Boise. We're looking to do possibly Las Vegas, possibly Colorado, Denver, or Colorado Springs, Fort Collins areas. So if you want to attend an event, you can email us at staff@openstoriesfoundation.org or mormonstories@gmail.com. Support our events. And then finally, realize that Tara Westover is coming to... actually, Greg Prince is coming to Salt Lake City this Saturday on St. Patrick's Day. We're going to be honoring and celebrating Greg Prince.
Is it not Friday?
Friday morning, he's going to be interviewing with us about his Leonard Arrington book.
I see.
Saturday night, he is going to be speaking to us. So please check out the Greg Prince event. We're going to honor Greg. 175 people have already signed up. So
That's great.
We're pretty sold out, but we're going to be honoring Greg at Community of Christ in Holiday Saturday night. But also make sure and come to the Tara Westover book signing and Q&A, which is going to be March 29th at First Unitarian Church in Salt Lake City around 7 o'clock. It's going to be a great event. Tara's book, Educated. Go out and buy it.
Yeah.
Share it. It's a powerful, important book. And we're really honored to be able to bring her to Salt Lake City.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
And then finally, there are all sorts of other ways to support us. Please like us, the Mormon Stories podcast page on Facebook. Please give the Mormon Stories podcast page a positive review. On Facebook, we have meanies come on all the time who don't listen to Mormon Stories, just want to malign us, and they give us 1-star ratings just to bring our ratings down when we know they haven't, in many instances, ever listened to us, but it's just through reputation or some authoritarian regimes.
You're the boogeyman.
Denunciation.
You're the boogeyman, John.
Yeah. So we need positive reviews on the Mormon Stories podcast page to keep our rating at 4.9 stars out of 5. We also need, follow us on Instagram, follow us on Twitter. And then finally, please go to iTunes and give us a positive review, 5-star review with a positive review, because those reviews help spread the word about this podcast. Thanks again to everyone who supports us. Thanks to Amy Grubbs, Director of Operations, Cody Layton, our podcast producer, Sharon Price for her work with events, and of course the Open Stories Foundation board that keeps our train on the tracks. Appreciate everybody. Thanks to all our listeners. Please share these episodes with friends and family. That also makes a big difference. And please take care and join us again soon for another episode of Mormon Stories. Thanks, Bert.
Yeah, thank you, John.
Take care, everybody.